I'm going to be talking about, well, there's me. I started New England Clean Energy about 14 years ago. My company has done a couple of thousand solar electric systems. We've even done, back in the day, we did small wind turbines and some solar hot water systems. So I've had my fingers and toes into a lot of renewable energy stuff. Over the last 5 or 6 years, I have been teaching classes for the Home Builders and Remodelers Association of Central Massachusetts. And that has afforded me some insight into how builders think. Any builders in the room? Okay. How do you think? No. The number one complaint that I used to get, and this seems to be going away, is that it's too expensive to build a low-energy house. Is that true? Yes? No, but it's not true anymore, right? It's getting better and better and less expensive. The biggest challenge that the builders would always come up with is, I can't sell that house if it's more expensive, right? And I would argue that having sold solar for 14 years now, and my average sale is $35,000, that you can sell a more expensive house, but you have to focus on the long term. And that's why I started this business, is because I've been focusing on the long term for a long time and trying to think about the planet. In 2006, I signed up to be trained by Al Gore to do climate change presentations. And I flew myself down to Nashville, and me and 1,000 of Al's best friends were trained in how to present on climate change. And then I did a whole bunch of presentations on that. In the meantime, I was starting the solar business because I have 3 kids, as it says up there. They are 27-year-old triplets. I'm really good with crowds. So if you raise your hand while I'm talking, that's totally cool. If you have a question, I can handle it without any worries about messing up presentation or anything. Ask questions of me. So let me get started with sort of where we're going today and talk about solar. First let me say that solar has evolved quite a bit. The marketplace has changed dramatically. The very first system I installed was in 2007, the very first PV system. The very first system I installed was a solar hot water system, but the very first PV system I installed was a solar electric system. It was 2,400 watts. It was 12 200-watt panels and an 1,800-watt inverter, and it was $24,000 or $10 a watt, all right? And if you talk to any of us old guys, they can tell you about $10 a watt, $9 a watt systems. I am now quoting systems anywhere from $3.50 a watt, even close to $3 a watt, depending on the system size. As they get bigger, they tend to get a little bit cheaper per watt. And the incentive back then when I sold that system was a 30% tax credit limited to $2,000. So that system had a 21-year break even, all right? But that homeowner was fairly well off, very environmentally conscious, and he was doing solar because of the environment, not about the money. In the 14 years I've been doing this, the market has evolved to the point where now people are doing it for the money and, oh, cool, I'm getting an environmental benefit, right? So it's about the economics first and the environmental aspect second. The good news is that with the costs the way they have come down, it's not that expensive to do a good environmental thing. As I said, even though my average sale is about $35,000, that system is going to pay for itself, depending on the roof, somewhere between 6 and 7, maybe 9 years. And I go to a family who's got a kid in the 4th grade, and I can say, you know, by the time your kids graduated high school, that system will be paid for, right? Or if they've got kids younger than that, even then, you know, even before they get into high school, you're going to own that system outright. You'll have paid off any loans you took, and you'll be saving money on your electricity for the next 25 or more years. So it's really been a big, big change. When I started the business, there were like 30 solar installers in all of Massachusetts. I'm guessing now, but there's probably 300 or more in Massachusetts. Some of us are reputable, and some of us could use some help. Anyways, what I hope to do is help you understand what you have to think about when you're doing the design and construction of a solar array. As I indicated, the economic appeal is dramatically better than it used to be. The major driver for people going solar is the economics, with the environmental being a secondary import now. Another aspect is that customers feel a little bit of independence from their solar, from their utilities. Anybody got any love here for National Grid or Eversource? You love National Grid and Eversource? Do you work for them? Yeah, okay, right. Maybe you want to leave. No, I'm kidding. I actually live in a town with a municipal utility, Hudson Light and Power. The rules are very different there for how they do solar electric, and every municipal has their own different set of rules, but the investor-owned utilities are all regulated the same. So if you live in National Grid, Unitil, or Eversource, East or West, you're going to get treated pretty much the same. The rates vary a little bit, but the process and how you get a solar system installed, not that difficult. We are certainly experts in the paperwork process, and there is a fair chunk of paperwork that goes with putting a solar system in. So the environmental aspect, the human health aspect of solar, of course, you're offsetting fossil fuels. Fortunately, the market is killing coal for us, so we don't have to worry too much about coal. It's slowly going away. We still have a fair amount of oil generated electricity around here and natural gas. Of course, the less of that we use, the less greenhouse gases we put up into the atmosphere, the better our air, and the cooler our planet stays. The houses are, for a large part, going electric. I'm seeing this more and more. Homes want to be either net zero or something very close to zero net energy, but the only way to do that is you have to be able to generate your own electricity on site. And the only current way to do that is, unless you have a nice stream in the backyard that you can do a hydro, facility from, which not many of us have, is to put an solar electric system up. For a while, I was in the small wind turbine business. That is not a backyard device, right? That is, wind turbines, A, there's not a lot of great sites for them, but B, the permitting and getting permission to put one in is pretty near impossible. I did 5 small wind turbines, and there was a zoning battle for almost every one, except for one I did on a farm, because farms have special, more loose zoning. So solar electric, on the other hand, almost very little, let's put it, very little zoning restrictions. You can put solar electric anywhere. But if you're running your house with any sort of heat pump, whether it's a ground source heat pump or air source heat pump, that's all electric. And you're going to want some way to generate that electricity. The other thing you're going to see more of is batteries. Batteries serve a couple of purposes. The most obvious one here is emergency backup. Depending on where you live, that can be very valuable. And then, of course, electric vehicles are up and coming, and I would bet that 5 years from now, pretty much every one of us is going to be driving some form of an electric vehicle, whether it's a hybrid like a Prius or plug-in hybrid, or just a straight electric like a Tesla or something. So big demand for electricity. Another reason solar has done so well in Massachusetts is, if you look at the price of electricity, it's pretty high. It's what, fourth highest in the nation. We can understand why Hawaii is crazy. There are islands way off of nowhere. But electricity is expensive. And that's the economic motivation for people doing solar. The other thing, too, to look at is electricity in Massachusetts has been climbing residential rates at about 4% a year, and that's been going on for roughly 15 years now. It's pretty steady, constantly increasing. You see some big jumps and little jumps and some dives down, but if you draw a best fit line, you'll see a 4% fairly steady rate, 3.9, 4.1. It varies a little bit. Each time I add a new year to the curve, the line moves a little bit, but basically 4% is a good forward-thinking number. This chart is really telling. It shows what it looked like in 2006. That's about the time I was getting started. Maybe one of those dots was mine in 2006. Now you look at 2016. By then, I'd probably done 1,500 systems or so, and so 1,500 of those dots are mine. It's really, really going crazy. You see there's 2 basic kinds of solar. You see what's called roof mount or behind the meter systems. Those are serving on-site load, right? That's what most homes do. You put a solar system on your roof to serve your on-site load. And then you see what I call merchant sites, where there's no on-site load, and those systems are designed to serve the grid and wherever that power is needed. We're seeing an explosion of merchant sites happening out in the central part of the state, northern Worcester County, southern Worcester County. That is creating some headaches for the utilities. Not my problem. I don't do merchant sites. I do all behind the meter solar. But the coolest thing about behind the meter solar is it really doesn't affect the grid. It doesn't put any demands on existing networks to speak of, maybe an occasional transformer upgrade, but it dramatically reduces what the grid needs to transport and helps the homeowner with the bottom line. Let's talk about greenhouse gas targets. The greenhouse gas emission targets were supposed to drop to 25% by 2020 and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Frankly, the only way we're going to get there is through things like converting our fossil fuel generation to solar or other renewables. Now, I talked a little bit about this. The cost of solar has dropped. They showed it about $4 a watt. The growth of solar has been exponential. It just makes sense. One of my coworkers is interesting. You know, we hear about these negative setbacks. You know, oh, they ran out of. You know, there used to be a period when we ran out of rebates, back when they had rebates, and then when the SREC program existed and the SREC prices were dropping. These are the incentives that existed. And now we're into the SMART program, and the SMART program, the incentives are stepped down in blocks. And he's sort of, you know, fairly mellow about it, and he says, ultimately it will win. And when you press him on that, he says, because the marginal cost of that next kilowatt hour is zero from the solar. Once you build that system, the next kilowatt hour is zero. It costs you nothing. As opposed to having to pull a train car of coal up to a boiler or a tanker of oil or pipe in gas. You have to keep feeding those beasts for them to keep generating electricity. And solar, we don't have to keep feeding it. So once it's built, it just keeps working. And you know, the maintenance costs are noise compared to the fuel costs of a fossil fuel facility. So yes, prices have dropped, $4 a watt. Realistically, you can do better than that if you do a bigger system. It's pretty amazing what's happened. The numbers actually work quite well. As I indicated in my introduction, we have prices dropping dramatically. The incentives have been in great support. As I said, we had rebates, then we went to the SREC program. We currently have the SMART program. And the SMART program pays you, or pays the homeowner per kilowatt hour they generate. Depending on what your utility is, it's around 8 or 9 cents if you're National Grid, and I think it's around 12 or 13 cents if you're Eversource. It's hard to keep track because the numbers change a little bit. When you build a house, if you build it the right way, you can maximize what you get out of the solar array. And of course, putting solar helps electrify the grid and supports people's demand for clean energy. So let's talk about equipment a bit. First off, the systems are not hard. We put panels on the roof, sometimes on a ground mount. The panels generate DC, so we have to convert that DC over to AC. So you have something called an inverter or multiple inverters. There's either an inverter per panel or one inverter somewhere down in the basement or the garage. The power feeds through to the main panel of the house after it's been inverted, and then from there it either flows to the house or it flows out to the grid. And there's a meter put on the side of the house called a net meter, and that net meter either does a forward or backward dance depending on which way current is flowing. The laws of physics say the electricity is going to flow to wherever the nearest voltage drop is. So if you turn on your dishwasher, that creates a voltage drop. That's where that electricity is going to go. You turn off your dishwasher and everything else in your house, you're not using any of your solar. Where does it go? Because the voltage on the solar system is a tiny bit higher than what's out on the street, it pushes it back through to the street. Think of it as water in a pipe, and now your lowest pressure point coming in on the water is out at the street. But the meter counts it going backwards versus forwards. Now, in the olden days, I love telling this story, people figured out that if you put in a meter upside down, it would count backwards. And so people, to save on their electric bill, would flip their meter over, and then before the meter reader would come out, they'd flip it back over, and the power companies started to figure this out and said, oh, wait a second, we're going to fix that. So all current existing standard meters count up no matter which way electricity flows. and flipping the meter over isn't going to work for you. Interestingly enough, a net meter doesn't. It works like the old meter flipped upside down. Well, except that you have to flip it when, depending on which way your power. Fortunately, we have smart electronics that do all that for us now. I tell that story only because one of the most frustrating periods for a customer who's bought solar is the couple of weeks between the time we finish the system and the time the utility comes out and swaps the meter. They say, hey, why can't I turn on my system? It's ready, you guys are done, it was inspected, can I turn it on? No, because if you turn it on, any power you send out to the grid, you will get charged for. So, if you ever deal with someone who wants solar, tell them be patient, wait for the power company to do that meter swap. So, I can't tell you how many phone calls I've taken because of that level of frustration. Okay. Solar panels, very well-known technology, been around a long time, very reliable, no moving parts. I mean, there's just so much good about these things. They just don't fail. I mean, if you look at the things that fail on a solar array, solar panels are probably the least likely thing to fail. And if they fail, it's usually because they got broken by some other force, you know, a branch or a baseball or a soccer ball or something else. Occasionally, and I have to say in 14 years, maybe I've replaced a dozen panels, you get some panel that expands and contracts and the glass breaks. Right? The panel will still work, just not at quite as high output, and eventually water will start to get into that panel and destroy it. But they will function for quite a long time, even with a broken glass. So there's silicon in there, electrons hit the silicon, they get the the sunlight hits the silicon, gets the electrons moving, that generates the DC. A typical panel nowadays, I would say the average panel wattage that we sell is somewhere around 340 watts. Our typical sort of Chinese module, 335, 325 watts. If you want an all-black version of that panel, it might be 350 watts. Our high-end panels, LG is now selling a 370. SunPower is selling a 400-watt panel. It's a little bit bigger than the 370. That's one of the things that confuses people. They say, oh, he's selling a 400 and you're selling a 370. You have to look at the size of the panels, right? Because sometimes you can get 400 watts by making the panel a little bit bigger, but the power density on those panels might actually be the same. They might both be 20 watts per square foot. It's just the form factor means that the LG can only do 370, but the SunPower can do 400. Point is, panels are getting bigger. My very first system, I said, were 200-watt panels. Those were high-end panels back then. The current, the high-end panel the typical panel back then was about 170 watts. So panel output, the size has gone up about 60%, but the output has doubled. So we're seeing a pretty nice growth in how much a panel can produce. Warranties, typically they have a 25-year power production warranty on a panel. Depending on the manufacturer, they may have a 12-year material warranty or a 25-year material warranty. And then the high-end companies, that's Panasonic, SunPower, and LG, also have a 25-year labor warranty. What that means is they pay the installer some money to go out and replace a failed panel. Those are, I mean, the high-end warranties are phenomenal, but that sort of is evidence at how reliable these panels are. When LG says, yeah, we'll give you $450 to go out and replace a panel, and you never actually have to go out and replace a panel, it's sort of an empty warranty. But it's nice to know it's there, right? The options, most common nowadays are monocrystalline cells. Those are all black. There's also polycrystalline. You'll see those are blue. They're bluish colored cells. The efficiencies vary a tiny bit. The costs are very competitive. There was a time when poly was a lot cheaper than mono, but everybody likes mono better because it performs better under high temperature. And so we're seeing more and more panels with monocrystalline. The panels are very low profile, so they're low to the roof, usually 3-4 inches. For a while, we used to do 6-inch pedestals. It helped the cooling, it prevented squirrels, but then we found that we weren't having much squirrel problems, so we've now gone to a lower pedestal. So the panels sit very close to the roof. The racking typically is all black. The frames and the panels are all black. So they largely disappear on the roof. I was teasing the architect over here. When I first started the business, they were all about how they looked, about how panels were ugly. And my counter to that is, you get over how ugly they are when you get a zero electric bill. suddenly the beauty of the electric bill is far surpasses the ugliness of the solar panels. And that has been true. I have panels on my house. I have a hip roof. It's a triangle, so my panels are staggered, and it's kind of funky looking. I don't even notice it anymore. I mean, I drive by it. If I do see it, I go, there are my solar panels, cool. I don't even think about it, right? And a lot of people do that. At first, they get all anxious about how it's gonna look, and then 3 months later, they've forgotten they're up there. So it's a neat evolution to see. Perhaps the biggest group to complain about solar are historic districts. Have you ever done any work in a historic district? Anybody? No? At least one time, the argument I used with a historic district was, look, the roof is already shingles, asphalt shingles. That's not period. We're going to put solar panels over top of a non-period roof. Why are you giving us such a hard time? I was, of course, much nicer about it. You know? All right. So other things, there's thin film solar. You don't see that on a roof. There was a period where they were trying it out. But what happened was the cost of regular polysilicon and monosilicon solar panels came down so dramatically that the economic prospect for thin film solar just sort of disappeared as a roof application. It wasn't as reliable. It wouldn't last as long. Integrated solar, how many of you have heard of the Tesla roof? How many know there's about 12 Tesla roofs installed across the nation? Yeah, a lot of hype, not a product. There are a couple of other companies, however, that are doing integrated solar roofs. DuPont has a product. I think they just sold it to Real Good Solar. CertainTeed also has a product. They have approached me to offer it. Currently, I do not want to be in the roofing business, so I am not necessarily fond of it. It's more expensive. And the other thing that's interesting about solar panels is as they get warm, they produce less electricity. That is part of the reason they are mounted 3 to 4 inches off the roof, is to keep the heat from building up behind the cell and keep the panels running more efficiently. So these solar roofs will have a slow adoption. There will be houses that the people are doing it because they can afford it and they just don't like the looks. But there are a lot of trade-offs to these integrated solar roof products. So this is the flush-mounted system on the left. That's very common. You can see they had to work around a couple of bathroom vents and vent pipes. We do that all the time. If we can convince the customer to move them, we will move them. They usually don't want to pay the plumber to have that work done. Tilt rack mounting, that's a funky tilt rack. That's not a picture I would have used if I put this slide together. Most of the tilt racks now are ballasted systems on flat roofs. And ballasted systems generally don't create any penetrations, any holes in the roof. This happens to be a tilt rack where they've attached to what looks like standing metal seam roofs. But typically, the costs and wind loads associated with tilting don't offset the benefits that you get from tilting them. At most, on a commercial flat roof nowadays, typical tilt is 5 degrees. That's a trade-off, right? You're giving up a little production. The ideal tilt might be 37 degrees, but at 5 degrees, you're not getting maximum production. But because a panel is tilted at 35 degrees, it creates a huge amount of wind load, and therefore a huge amount of ballast is required, and most roofs can't handle that much ballast. You tilt the panels down to 5 degrees, you put an air deflector on the back, you use some ballast underneath the air deflector to hold the array down, much less ballast than you would use if the panels were tilted at 35. So you trade off some production to keep the roof whole. You're seeing more canopies. Right now, most of the canopies you'll see are either self-constructed. There really isn't there are some companies out there that are starting to build canopies where I can go, go to a catalog and get a canopy for, 5 kilowatts worth of solar. Same with carports. Largely, these are self-constructed. The pole mounts and other ground mount systems, and then there's trackers. A tracking solar array is one where the panels actually follow the sun, both adjust pitch as well as azimuth. Pitch generally doesn't change during the day, but azimuth certainly follows the sun. The only downside to trackers is you really need to have a good open space so you can pick the sun up at 7 in the morning and follow it till 7 at night. Much of eastern New England, there aren't many spaces like that, so trackers aren't something you'll see here. I have some friends in the business that live out in Greenfield, and they're the #1 trackers installer in Massachusetts. They've done 60 or 80 of them, but they live around a lot of farmland where there's lots of open fields, so those trackers can pick the sun up in the morning and follow it the whole day. So there are places for trackers. I do a fair amount of ground mounts. Depends. I'll show you. There's some nice pictures here as we go forward about houses that don't lend themselves well to solar. That's when we go to a ground mount, or someone has open space and they really don't want to put it on their house, or they have a slate roof, or their house is in the shade, or so on, and lots of reasons. Inverters, as I said earlier, they convert the DC to AC. You can either have an inverter that does the whole array, or you can have one inverter per panel, a microinverter they call it. Very common, we've done both. I can't say I'm partial to one or the other. My installers like the microinverters because they seem to go in a little bit faster. But now you have a piece of electronics up on the roof. At first, that was a thing that was, you know, oh my God, we got to put electronics on the roof. Well, the Massachusetts Electric Code changed fairly recently, and now every panel has to have some form of electronics on it in order to shut that panel down when the power gets shut off. It's something called rapid shutdown. So when we put a panel on the roof, if it's got a microinverter, it meets rapid shutdown. If it doesn't have microinverters, it has what's called an optimizer / rapid shutdown box. And so every panel has to have some form of shutdown built into it. So when power gets shut off at the street, so if there's a fire at the house, the firemen either pull the meter or they cut the service to the house. That shuts down the solar array. But it also shuts down any DC coming off of the panel, so there are no live wires left once the power has been shut off to the building. In older systems, if you shut off power to the street, you could conceivably still have live DC coming off the roof. Now, all DC goes in metal conduit, and a fireman is loath to cut into metal conduit, but there's still always a chance. So they really asked for this rapid shutdown feature. We've sort of moved into it without sort of a blip because some of the manufacturers came along with some great products, and so that problem has been solved. It has added a little bit of cost, a little bit of a headache, because as you know, electronics occasionally fail. Typically when electronic, like an inverter fails, it's within the first year. We call it infant mortality in the electronic, vernacular. After, once you get a device that's going to run along, they'll run forever. Warranties on the microinverters and on the optimizers are 25 years. And that's even up in the hostile environment of being on your roof where it gets so hot. These electronics will go 25 years. So warranties, inverters typically 10 to 12 years, optimizers 25 years, microinverters 25 years. The question you have to ask when you're buying these things is that company going to be here 25 years from now? Or will there be a suitable replacement? Most houses, most of our systems have monitoring now. The nice thing about panel level electronics is you get panel level data. So you can see what's going on a solar array at every panel. I have, for example, I have N-phase microinverters on my house. And there was a period where they had a product that was having some issues. With N-phase, I could see every panel, and I saw 3 of my microinverters fail. I call N-phase, well, my company called N-phase, and they said, hey, we got this site. We think we have 3 microinverters that are failed. They go online, they look at it, they go, yep, we're sending you 3 warranty replacements. You'll have them in a week. And then the installer schedules and goes out and replace my microinverters as part of the warranty service. So that's pretty common now. Same thing with our other product, SolarEdge. When an optimizer fails, the manufacturer goes online and says, yep, you got a dead optimizer. They send us a replacement, and then we go out and do the repair. The monitoring also serves the data needs for payments for SRECs and smart incentives. Remember I said the smart payment pays you so many cents per kilowatt hour. Well, how many kilowatt hours did you generate? You get that off of your data system of your inverter. The panel level data turns out to be really helpful for a homeowner or an installer like me. I'd say about 6 months ago, I got a call from a customer who had had his system in for 2 years. And he says, hey, Mark, one of my panels is really doing lousy. Can you take a look? So I pull up the monitoring, I look at his array, and I see one panel is like 40% of the rest of the array. And I said, okay, let me look at some pictures from your site. And so I pull up a bunch of pictures, and sure enough, he's got a satellite dish right next to the panel, and it was casting a shadow, and it was dramatically reducing production. So I called him back, and I said, you want to move that satellite dish? And I said, oh, and by the way, When you call DirecTV and they say it's $100 to move the dish, tell them that you want to cancel the service, and they will move the dish for free. There's your $100 I saved you today. Let's see, storage. I mentioned that a bit earlier. There are some neat programs now for storage. There's an adder to the smart payments. So if you're getting 9 cents a kilowatt hour to put a solar system in and then you put in a battery, you'll get an additional 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour to put in a battery. There's also a demand response program where if the utility can use your battery to help shave some peaks, like on one of those brutal July afternoons where it's 90% humidity and you don't want to go outside because you just start dripping wet, those peak afternoons, they will take control of the battery and use it to shave, to lower or supply electricity to the grid, and they pay you for those events. It's a few $100 per event. You know, there's a half a dozen events a year. The program runs for 5 years, so if you put a battery system in, you could make a few $1,000s. It doesn't cover the cost of the battery, but it makes it a lot less painful. Batteries, of course, don't need any maintenance. You don't have to run them once a month to make sure they're working. You don't have to feed them with gas. And there's a lot of flexibility in the battery systems. So literally yesterday, I was down on the Cape. I went to Harwich, because you all remember they had a little tornado a month or so ago, maybe a month and a half. I got a call from a guy. He has a solar system from a company that's now out of business, but he said, my generator did not start. And I don't want to put another generator in. So what can you do for me for a battery? So I'm going to put in a 15 kilowatt hour battery. It won't serve the whole house, but it'll run his furnace, or his refrigerator, you know, some of the critical, what we call protected loads. So he'll be able to have heat, he'll be able to have cold food and some lights, maybe charge his phone, that sort of thing. And if he's careful about his loads, he can run on that 15 kilowatt hour battery quite some time, and then when the sun comes out, the sun's going to charge that battery for him, so he could live off grid if he had to for some time, provided he's careful about what he runs. Now, in that case, that battery will support the whole house. He could run any circuit in the house, but we're going to suggest that he not do that because he could use up all of his battery in probably half a day if he tried to run the whole house off of it. So the battery's 15 kilowatt hours. This is a big house. You know, chances are he's using 30 kilowatt hours a day, depending on whether he's heating or air conditioning, and the battery wouldn't support that. So, okay, so let's go into some economics. There are the smart incentive, comes out of the DOER. There's net metering, particularly in the investor-owned utilities. Anybody here live in a municipal utility? Town? What town? North Reading and Concord. Okay. I don't know a lot about North Reading. I know Concord is very progressive when it comes to solar systems, but their incentives are a little bit different than they are in most of the munis, probably better than most munis. So it's a good town to have solar in. Right? We like doing work in Concord, and we've done a bunch of systems there. And then, of course, there's a federal tax incentive that's 30%, but effectively, if you talk to me or any other good installer, we are sold out for the year. We cannot sell another system and guarantee installation by the end of this year. And therefore, any systems we install, if you signed with me today, I'd say you're going to get the 26% federal tax credit, not the 30% federal tax credit. And that might be worth $1,000, not a make or break number. It sucks that it's going down. If it gets preserved at 30%, we won't know about it until the end of the year, and it'll be a surprise announcement in the legislature at the federal level like it happened last time. Because 2 years ago, this federal tax credit was supposed to start dropping, and then all of a sudden they announced federal tax credit preserved, and the trade-off that they made was with the oil industry, where they allowed the oil industry to export oil. And who knows what deals are being cut down in Washington right now to try to keep the federal tax credit at 30%, but even if it goes to 26%, you're okay. On a commercial system, the rules are different. We can spend 5% on the project this year and lock in that 30%. But on a residential system, we can't do that. So you will only get 26% after January 1st. There's also a Massachusetts state tax credit. It's $1,000. There's a group of folks I know in the industry that are lobbying to try to get that number uncapped to make up for the sliding federal tax credit, to make up for the decreasing smart payments. There are a bunch of ways to own a system. My company only does purchase systems, so you can buy it with your cash or you can finance it through banks I work with. And that's pretty common. There's also leases and power purchase agreements. What is a lease or what is a power purchase agreement? They put the solar array on your roof. It belongs to them. They sell you the power off your roof at a discount compared to what you would pay your utility. So maybe if you're paying 23 cents with Eversource and you put a solar system on your roof with a PPA, they might charge you 16 cents or 17 cents. So you're saving a nickel or maybe a little bit more per kilowatt hour. For some people, that's the way to go. I used to try to sell these third-party ownership programs, but I found that almost always the purchase it or finance it is a better financial investment. You don't see the immediate savings that you might see, but if you can use the tax benefits, then the tax credit makes a huge dent, and then you're way ahead by the end of just 5 or 7 years. Anybody here not paying taxes? Yeah, so pretty much everybody can use the tax credit, but occasionally I run into someone who's retired on a fixed income and they have very low tax liability. In those cases, you can see a power purchase agreement working very well. The other place where power purchase agreements work is in the commercial space, and largely it's because these companies have limited capital and they don't necessarily want to spend it on solar. I went to one client and talked to him about buying a system, and he says, look, I can buy a left-handed smoke shifter. I think he did big presses, stamping presses. He says, I can buy a stamping press for $300,000 and it'll pay for itself in 6 months. So I'm going to take my $300,000 or my line of credit or whatever and buy stamping presses before I'm going to spend $600,000 on solar that's going to take 4 years to pay for itself. In that case, I say, okay, well, in that case, how about a no capital commitment? You can put the system on your roof and we'll sell you the power at a discount. And so when you're a commercial establishment, owning the system may not be the best thing, and it's largely because of how they want to use their capital. I have heard horror stories about getting free of the lease or getting the new homeowner to own the lease. I know that when you try to buy out a system, let's say you've lived in a house 3 or 4 years and you move, right? But it's got a leased system on the roof or a PPA system on the roof. The buyout price on that system is not going to be a depreciated price. It's going to be whatever the remaining value that system has to the owner of the system. So if the system was 30 grand nominally when it was put in, and you run it for 3 years, and they get to take 3 years of SRECs, and they take their tax and all that stuff, that system might still be $25,000 to buy out. But for you to buy a brand new system might be 20 or less. So it can be an expensive way to get out of the system. So hopefully the new homeowner will assume the lease. And that's where you start to run into challenges with leased systems, is that the new homeowners often don't want them for whatever reason. I mean, I think it's a good thing for the new homeowner even to take on the lease, but it's, every buyer is different too. So some people are like, yeah, sure, I'll take it. Other people are like, should I take it? Any of you ever gone out on Reddit, go out on the solar thread, and you'll see people posting that question maybe once a week. Hey, I'm about to buy a house and it's got a solar system on it. It's leased by Solar City. Should I take it, right? Or should I force the homeowner to buy out the lease before I buy the house, right? The best deal is to get the homeowner to buy out the lease before you buy the house. But it's not necessarily a bad deal to take the house and assume the lease with Solar City, provided you have the credit score and all that stuff. So I know that was clear as mud, wasn't it? It is. That's right. That's right. But sometimes the homeowners do that because they find it becomes an impediment to the sale. Half the problem is, I think, real estate agents, because a lot of solar agents assume that all systems are leased, and therefore they are a liability, and that's not true. I know the 2,000 that I've put in are all owned systems, and therefore they're an asset, right? The biggest challenge with an owned system is, like, I have a customer who's been in their house 5 years. They called me the other day, and they said, we still have 5 years worth of SRECs income on our house. We figure that 5 years worth of SRECs is worth 20 grand. How do we put that into the value of the house? And I've not got a good answer for that. One way to do that is just put it into the price of the house. Another way is to negotiate with the buyer. Say, yeah, you buy the house for this price. If you want the SREX, it's this price. Or you put in a cellular modem-based meter that reports production, and you still own the SREX even though you don't own the house. It can be done. Okay, this is a neat slide. I have a similar version of this in my typical proposal. It shows what happens if you do nothing versus what happens if you go solar. And of course, if you do nothing, you're just going to keep spending money for electricity. But if you put in a solar system, you're going to buy the solar system and spend some money on the system. This is like a finance system. And somewhere out, I don't know, this one shows somewhere around 8 or 9 years, you've covered your cost and broken even. And then after that, it's just generating savings for you. Depending on when this incentive ends, you might be earning smart before your loan is even paid off. You could earn smart above and beyond your loan payments. So probably the number one question I get asked is, why isn't everybody doing this? And I can't answer that question. I don't know why everybody isn't doing this. It's very compelling. I mean, clearly, if you're only going to be in your house a couple of years, that's a good reason to not put solar on it. It's a big expense, right? But if you're going to be there 5, 6, 7, 10 years, it's an absolute no-brainer, unless your house is in the shade, right? And there's not, I mean, short of cutting down trees, there's not much we can do about that. System price, yeah, here's a typical system, $18,000. You get a federal tax credit of $5,500, a state tax credit of $1,000. You're going to earn $600 a year in smart payments for 10 years. So after year one, you've spent $11,000. Your loan payment, $124, $52 a month in smart payments. Your net per month is a positive 72. Am I reading that right? Yes. You're saving total $28 a month. Every installer that's worth their salt, when they come out and does a proposal, they will give you numbers, something like this. They'll show you what your monthly expense is before solar and what it is afterwards. More often than not, your monthly expense goes negative. In other words, you're making income even though you're paying the loan off on the system. So, and then the assumptions on this one are all down at the bottom. Okay, if you bundle PV into a mortgage, I'm working with a builder, hint, hint. The builder said, hey, you know, why would I do solar? What would I tell a homeowner? And I said, well, let's look at what happens if you add a $20,000 solar system to a house or a $40,000 solar system to the house, and then you finance that mortgage at 4% for 30 years. What is the net effect on the cost of the house? As you can see, the electricity savings alone is enough to, even though you're getting a slightly larger mortgage, you've reduced your electric bill by, in the case of the $20,000 solar system, $19 a month, and $40,000 system, you've reduced your electric bill $40 a month, and your net cost out of pocket is lower than just the mortgage. So financing the solar system into a mortgage when you buy a house is actually a really good thing. And the system is as good as the house. It's going to go 25 or more years. You might have to replace the inverter at some point, but like the inverters now, you know, our standard warranty on an inverter is 12 years, easily extendable to 25 years. The microinverters all have 25-year warranties. So, and your maintenance cost on a solar system is virtually nil. The most likely cost on a system, and this is not on a new house, but this is on an existing house, is if you had shingles that were 10 years old, and 15 years into your solar system, you decide you need to re-roof. There's a few $1,000s in labor for me to come out, and some materials for me to come out and take the system down, let your roofers do their thing, and then we put it back up. So, but that's it. I mean, there's no moving parts. There's nothing to wash or clean. Mother Nature does a great job of keeping the panels clean, and you don't have to worry about dust or soot. The only thing that builds up on a panel is snow, and Mother Nature takes care of that just, you know, when it warms up. So. New construction, you clearly want to work with your architect and your builder. There's some details about putting in solar, relatively easy to address, but you should address them beforehand. The number one disappointment for me to show up on a new house is to find a vent pipe in the middle of a space where I want to put solar, right? And plumbers, any plumbers in the room? Good, they're lazy. I mean, that they will put the vent pipe wherever it's convenient for them, right? They will not think about what's going on the roof. They don't even want to be on the roof most of the time. So you got to talk to the plumber before he pokes his vent pipe through the roof, for example, right? Of course, how you orient the house, what you put on the roof for dormers, all that stuff has to be discussed, and what's the style of the house, and we'll get into some of that. So before you do the installation, of course, you want to talk to the builder and the architect, the homeowner, the solar installer, so we can get the process going. As I said, there's a fair amount of paperwork, and the utility takes their time, and not malicious, just big company, kind of stuff. There's in building a new house, there's sort of, in my mind, an optimal time to put the solar system on. The roof is up, the shingles are on, you haven't done any inside work except maybe started the electrical and the plumbing, but there's no drywall, no insulation. That is the best time to do a solar system because we can come through the roof with our conduit, and then we can run our conduit down to wherever the electric panel is going to be, and we're not having to deal with drywall, plaster, or any of that stuff. Right? So it just goes really much faster when we can work in a raw house like that. Clearly, the roof has to be up, right? During the construction, we typically will jump into a house and pull our conduit, or the electrician that's doing the rest of the house will do it. Varies by the project. Of course, as we're installing, we're doing the right labels. At least the conduit has to be labeled. Then once we get the system installed, then there's all sorts of signs that have to go up. After inspections, after the utility's happy and the system's tested, we get the system turned on. It says apply for incentives here. We've actually applied for incentives back at the beginning. And once we get all the paperwork, the system completed, signed off by the electrical and building inspectors, then we just tell the incentive authority, hey, it's all done, and then they start the incentive going. Clearly, you want to work with a HERS rater. Any HERS raters in here? A couple of you, good. The HERS raters can estimate kilowatt-hour loads. I find they're pretty good at it too. The models are really sophisticated and gotten better and better over time. I like this equation here where it says kilowatt-hours divided by 350 gives you an estimated number of panels. Obviously, that will change as panels get more efficient, but it's a pretty good number. 350, a good divider if you're quick and dirty, right? So. We want to, of course, align the design with the load, right? If you think the house is going to use 10,000 kilowatt hours, I said this earlier, we generally design the system to meet the 10,000 kilowatt hour load, and that will vary based on panel and roof orientation and shading and so on and so forth. This slide gets into a level of detail that most people don't care about, but they have tilt and orientation factor, the TSRFs. And I do all that. I do all that math. I do the production estimates. I can tell you with fairly degree of certainty what a system's going to produce based on site shade readings, roof pitch, roof heading. We know. Right? The cool thing is from year to year to year, the amount of sun we get is pretty consistent. And so we can predict that fairly well.
One thing to highlight on here, so in the design process, it's important to consider where your vent pipes are going to go and if dormers are going to provide shading. And so the installer or the solar sales company will do all these calculations for you. But in the design process, it's important to provide a roof that is as solar ready as possible.
Let me give you some examples about that. I'm working with a customer down in Rhode Island, and they're building a new house, and they said, Mark, here's our roof, how much can you fit on it? Well, one of the things I noticed was on the south side of the house, they had a beautiful south-facing roof, but right in the middle of that south-facing roof, on the edge of the house, was a fireplace with a chimney that went up about 10 feet on the south wall. And I said, well, given that the south wall is already the warmest wall in a house, why would you put the fireplace on the south wall? Why don't you move the fireplace to the middle of the house? That will solve two problems. A, you'll get better heat for the house with the fireplace. It was actually a wood stove, not a fireplace. And you'll get rid of that chimney shadow going across the solar array. Because that chimney shadow would go across the array during the day and knock production down on the panels that it's shading. Right? And they sent me the revised design, and sure enough, they moved the fireplace to the middle of the house. Came out really nice where they put it, and they solved the shading problem on the roof. So that's why talking to me or an architect before you build the house is always a good idea. Talk to the solar installer, because he will know what you're doing wrong when it comes to from a shading standpoint. Yes?
What if you do have a shading problem?
Well, so the nice thing about our systems now, because each panel has panel level electronics, they are relatively shade intolerant. In the olden days, if I had a string of, let's say I had 27 panels, and I'd wire that 3 strings of 9, right? And I got shade on one panel in a string of 9, it would bring down the power of all 9 panels. Right? It's like putting a weak battery in a flashlight with a bunch of strong batteries, right? The weak battery sort of dictates how bright that flashlight's going to be. Same thing with solar panels. Nowadays, we have panel level electronics, so you can have shade on one panel and it won't bring down the other 8 panels in that same string. All right, so you no longer have that problem. So panel level electronics make the solar arrays far more shade tolerant. I have systems where there were existing chimneys, no way we could avoid them. We designed as best we could to avoid the shade. But you can watch, and the solar end phase has an animation where you can watch the power of a panel as the day goes on, and you can see these panels coming up, and then as the shadow moves across the array, you see them going down and then going up. It's really fun to watch, actually. But yeah, the panel level electronics have, for the most part, solved the shade problem. You know, I have a customer in Weston, out on Route 30, where he has 2 panels on the corner right by a chimney. And those 2 panels, their output is, 70% of the rest of the array. But those 2 panels aren't affecting the other 28 on the roof. So yeah, so shading, it happens. It's going to affect the economics, but we can design around it. So, did I answer your question? Okay. Yeah, first off, have a good relationship with your neighbor, and if you pay to take the tree down, they're probably going to be okay with it, right? Some people won't want the trees to come down, and there's not much you can do there. If you go out onto my blog, theenergymiser.net, there's an article called Tree Math, which talks about the trade-off of trees and solar from a carbon standpoint. Generally, taking trees down is a win from a carbon standpoint, given the sources of our electricity here in New England, all right? If we were already a fully solar site, then taking trees down would be not a good thing, but since we still have such a high percentage of carbon-based electricity, taking a few trees down versus putting a solar system, it's a huge win in terms of how much carbon you'll offset versus leaving the tree there. I'm not sure of the rules, but I'm pretty sure that that's your branch. So, yeah, you can take that off. But I would still check with the neighbor and say, hey, this branch hanging over my driveway, it's scaring me. I want to take it down. I'm sure not much they can do about that. So let's see, did I cover everything on this? Yeah, pretty much. Okay, so the house on the right, I call that house dormer hell. All right, there's just nowhere to put solar on that roof because the dormers, while cute and make the house look very New Englandy, just chew up all the useful space. You could maybe put a row of panels along the peak, but that's about it. Down in between the dormers, they're going to be in the shade all the time, and they're just not going to perform. Not only that, it's going to look really funky. And not to say I haven't done this. I have done roofs where I have panels down between dormers. Yeah, the house on the left, beautiful. Not a thing on it, clear, wide open, going to do great. All right. TSRFs of 100% are rare. So what is TSRF 100%? 100% roof is one that's 37 degrees due south, azimuth 180, okay? In my 14 years of doing this, I've had 2 roofs that had a TSRF of 100%. One of them was an accident. The house just happened to be built well. It was up on a hill, didn't have any trees around it. The other one was by an architect. She knew what the hell she was doing when she designed and built the house, right? Don't trust a compass. A compass with magnetic declination will give you the wrong south. You need, the smartphone compasses are nice because they correct for magnetic declination. I can't tell you how many houses I've looked at that I found, they said, oh, my house is due south. No, your house is azimuth 165 because you trusted a compass, right? So do find true south when you're looking for south, right? Use Google Earth or use the magnetic declination corrections that are built into your smartphone compass, right? And smartphone compasses are actually pretty good. So anyways, so those two houses were 100%. Everybody else is less. What affects production? Well, if your tilt is a little bit steeper or a little shallower than 37 degrees, you'll get a little less production. If your azimuth is off 180 a little bit, maybe to the west, to the east, and of course shading. You know, a chimney can be a factor, trees can be factors, all of those things get factored. The worst roof we have ever done had a TSRF of about 40%. Payback on that system was in Littleton. They have Littleton Light, and payback on the system was probably going to be 20 years. And, you know, I say to the customer, look, 20 years, you still want to do this? And their answer is, I want to go solar. It wasn't about how much kilowatt hours they were going to make and how much money they were going to save. It was about the going solar. But it was informed consent, right? We're going to put a system on your roof, and it's going to do really crappy. Are you okay with that? Yeah, I'm okay with that. A lot of people would have said no. Most of my customers would have said, nah, that's too low, I'm not going to bother, right? And so it really is a customer decision when you're talking about solar. But you guys get to design and build the house to maximize production, and if you can aim the house true south, awesome. But it doesn't have to be true south to be a good roof. It turns out an east-west shallow roof has a TSRF with no shade on it of about 84%. That's not bad. 84% is pretty good. When the state used to do the rebates, the cutoff was 80%. They wouldn't give you a rebate if your roof was below 80. So at 84%, that's not bad. A steep east-west roof might be 70%. That starts to get into the, not sure I want to do that. You all understand the difference? If you have let's say the sun comes up and you got a steep east-west roof. So the sun comes up in the morning and now you've got shade on the east side of the roof by midday, because the roof is shading the roof. But if you have a shallow roof, this side of the roof is going to stay in sun much longer. So an east and west facing roof can work. It's not ideal, but it can still be economically sound. So don't kill yourself if you can't orient the house perfectly south. Try to get it as much south as you can. Same thing with pitch. There's an optimal pitch depending on the azimuth, right? So if you're east facing, it should be shallow. If you're south facing, it should be steep, right? And so any solar installer can help you with that as well, right? Yes, and this slide sort of goes into, you know, we like to see lots of sun, 4 to 6 hours, open roof area, or if you have room on the ground, you know, room for a ground mount. So a lot of installers don't do ground mounts. They can be a pain, but that's something that we're pretty good at. So, okay, structural load. So we have snow loads, wind loads, orientation from structural elements, and then fire code. I already talked about the rapid shutdown. A typical solar load is at most 2.5 pounds per square foot. That's including panel, racking, and any panel level electronics, right? You're doing typically 2 anchor points per panel on the roof. So 40 panels figure about 80 anchor points. The point loads might be 20 pounds per point load, right? So modern construction, you know, if you're doing standard rafters, not trusses, then you're going to be fine most of the time, right? I tell you, we've run into these 1950s and 1960 ranches with 2x6s that are 19 feet long. That's going to be a problem, right? But who builds a 2x6 foot span now that's 19 feet? I mean, you wouldn't do that. It wouldn't meet code, right? So you're using 2x8s or 2x12s or whatever it is. You're putting in a knee wall, you're sistering rafters, whatever. And that's what we do when we get to a roof that can't meet load. We have to either sister up the rafters or we have to put in some sort of a knee wall. Sometimes it's simple as collar ties to keep the house from spreading when we add that extra load on the roof. So, where was I? Okay, rapid shutdown, that's on each panel. When the solar array gets shut down, the panels shut down. That is Massachusetts Electric Code, Rhode Island Electric Code, I think all of New England is currently at that code. There are parts of the country that have not yet adopted that. But where I live, we just do rapid shutdown on every system. Placement of conduit. The ideal is in the walls, through the roof, under the array, and then down in through the walls and somewhere, and come out where the panel's going to be, if it's in the garage or in the basement or wherever. So we can hide all that stuff during construction. As I said earlier, the ideal time to put in a system is while the roof is up, but the walls aren't. Right? And of course, we do all the labeling as part of the installation. Right? Solar does improve your HERS ratings. Right? 3 to 4 points of improvement for a HERS score for a kilowatt of solar. And then when you get your HERS score below 50, then that has some impact on the alternative energy certificates, with this young lady in the back of the room can answer questions about. Right? So you want to talk to her about what that means. Okay? And you can get like 5 points from a 2.5 kilowatt system. It's been a long time since I've done a system that small. 2.5 kilowatts is tiny. Our typical systems run between 8 and 10 kilowatts nowadays. Right? When I started the business, it was really hard to get 10 kilowatts on a roof because the panels were so much bigger, or the power density was so much lower. Nowadays, I can do 10 kilowatts on pretty much any roof. So there's something called a single parcel rule. I am involved in a group that's trying to get this changed, but currently you're only allowed 1 net meter per parcel of land. And so let's say you build a co-housing facility, and they all share 1 parcel of land, but everybody wants solar on their roof. Technically, you can't do it the way the rules are written right now. But the rule is inconsistently applied. Like, I've had National Grid sites where they've never even asked, and then I've had Eversource sites where they've been a pain about it, and then I've had Eversource sites where they don't even care. It's weird. Like, we have a co-housing several customers in a co-housing in Acton, and every one of those houses, or nearly every one of those houses, has solar on it. Every one of them has a net meter, even though it's all 1 parcel of land. But then I tried to do a 4th system for Mass Audubon in Lincoln at Drumlin Farms, and I went to put that 4th net meter on the site, and they said, nope, you're only allowed 1 net meter. And I'm like, but we already have 3 net meters on this site, and they started enforcing this new single parcel rule. It's a headache. And the rule was originally developed to keep the merchant site guys from splitting their solar arrays, these 5 megawatt arrays, splitting them into 2.5s to beat another regulation. And somehow that rule trickled down to affecting us little residential guys. So, I'm not sure if there's anything else I could say about this slide. Net metering rules. Yeah, in National Grid, Eversource, Unitil, if your system is 10 kilowatts or below AC, then you get full net metering. That's if you're single phase, so 240 volt single phase. If your system is below, if you're 3 phase, so that's 208 or 480, then you can go up to 25 kilowatts and still get full net metering. Thank you. The problem that is doesn't make any sense. There's no technical reasons why those should exist. I actually met with my legislator yesterday about getting that rule changed, and that may actually go away, fingers crossed. Because what happens is if you go above that 10 kilowatt residential or 25 kilowatt commercial, then you get what's called qualifying facility rates, which are about 3 cents kilowatt hour for anything left on your account at the end of a billing cycle. So customers want to generate excess in the spring and carry it forward to their air conditioning seasons. If their system is bigger than 10 kilowatts, it carries forward at 3 cents a kilowatt hour instead of at retail. And that's a pain in the neck. So we end up designing a lot of systems right up to that 10 kilowatt limit. We in fact overload inverters. An inverter might be rated at 10 kilowatts AC, but you can put 13 kilowatts DC behind that. I wrote another article about that on my blog. It's about inverter clipping. Go ahead and read it when you get a minute. It's a major headache. It's a limit, particularly now where people are trying to get net zero homes. If you want to go above that 10 kilowatt threshold, the numbers start to get kind of ugly because you're only getting 3 cents for carried over electricity. And that's just not economically sensible. So that law, I am honest to God, I met yesterday with my rep to try to get that law changed, get that rule changed. So clean south-facing roof, coordinate between the architect and the builder. Massachusetts said they already have a provision in the building code called Solar Ready Roof. It's literally 3 paragraphs in the code. I recommend you read it. I could email you the chapter, but I don't have it, the actual reference. Of course, solar, what it does is lower your greenhouse gas emissions, give us better air and water, Of course, planet health is all about it. You know, what solar is good for. Pay less for electricity, some independence. There's a home value study that Zillow just published, and they say nationwide, homes with solar sell for about 4.1%. Anecdotally, I have seen this, but I don't have the data like Zillow does. And then that 4.1% number varies a bit depending on where you are, where you live, where your house is, right? I just ran the numbers for a customer where I went and pulled his Z estimate, and then I said, okay, so let's take your Z estimate and add 4%, and the 4% Z estimate of his Z estimate was about the cost of the solar system. And this is a house in Sudbury. So Sudbury houses tend to be a little bit pricier. So, it's like I can spend $30,000 or $40,000 on this system and have it go right into the value of the house. And that's not counting the electric savings. That's not counting the smart payment. It's not counting the planet friendliness and everything. It's where we need to go, guys. It's how we make our houses net zero and dramatically reduce planet impact of homes and our living. Peel and stick solar panels. I think they're going to have neat applications. I wouldn't put them on a roof, but I think, you know, I've been asked by customers about windows that were solar generating. Anybody here ever work on a deck home? You're familiar with all that glass? And they contacted me. They said, it's time to replace our windows on the south side. Do you have an integrated product? I do not have a good integrated product, but a peel and stick might actually work for them. So I'd be curious to see what's out there, because I'd investigate it. Right now, it's really small because they're still pretty expensive. But you know, if it gets to 5 or 10% by the end of, say, I don't know, 3 years, that would be, to me, pretty good pace. But you know what? We're seeing fairly dramatic movements. One product out there is by a company called Sonnen. Do you know who bought Sonnen recently? Shell Oil. Another big product out there called Pika. You know who bought Pika? Generac, the generator company. So suddenly these small battery companies are being bought up by these massive companies. So that tells you a lot. They're serious. It's already baked in for the most part. The panel sellers were smart. They didn't pass along savings when they anticipated the tariffs. And then once the tariffs hit, they weren't as bad as they thought, so they started reducing panel prices again. We've seen a fairly flat panel prices have been fairly flat as of late. So we're done. The tariffs have done their damage, and we're mostly through that. So a typical panel, the high-end panels are all rated at about 90% of their original output at year 25. So that's less than 0.5% a year. Yeah, very low. That's their warranted degradation rate. In real life, we don't see that. They don't degrade as fast as the warranty allows for them to degrade. So, I mean, my system I put up in 2007, it's probably still right about what it was when it was originally put in. There are bigger factors like shade and dust than the actual panel degradation. No, that's a good question. So we generally size a system to match the load. So I will take your last year's electric bill, and let's say your bill was 9,480 kilowatt hours over the last year. I'm going to try to design a system pretty close to that, plus or minus a few percent. Unless you tell me that, oh, by the way, I'm going to buy an electric car in the fall, or I'm switching over to mini split, so my load's going to go up. And therefore, you're going to use everything, or pretty much everything that you produce. And so your payback is based on assuming you use everything you produce. One of the things to know about the investor-owned utilities is if you have excess production on your account, you will never get paid for it. Okay? So you generally don't want to overbuild the system. Now, that's not saying there are ways for you to allocate excess. There's something called a Schedule Z, one of those paperwork hells that I deal with, and that says, take 20% of my excess and send it to my mother down the street, or send it to my sister across town, provided the other customer's in the same load zone, and load zones are really big, you know, northeastern Massachusetts, southeastern Massachusetts. Provided they're in the same load zone, you can sell your excess, whatever, your excess to another account. So yes, but your break even assumes that you're going to use everything you produce. I would recommend it. However, Yeah. I have one customer right now with $3,000 worth of excess. He forgot or did his Schedule Z wrong or something, I don't know. And there's no way for him to just blanket transfer all that excess to another account. He has to chip away at it. My advice to him was, get the electric car now, because you're going to charge it for free for $3,000 worth of electricity, or start heating your house with electricity and use up the excess that way. So if you oversize now, you're going to want to use some of that electricity until you get to the point where you have your electric car. So there's a little bit of balance when to do that. But I do recommend that you design for the future. This happens a lot. Customer calls me up and says, hey, Mark, you did my system 4 years ago. I want more. Great. I got to put in a whole standalone system. It's got to have its own inverter, its own metering. It's on a different incentive program than you did 4 years ago. Oh, and by the way, there are other issues around net metering system sizes that mean that the excess kilowatt hours may not be worth as much. And that's a subtlety that I'm not going to get into in this crowd. So the biggest thing for, at least so from a business standpoint, it means I need to become a roofer now. So that's new and different. That's hard. I'm not sure I'm ready to take on that kind of a thing. The other thing is the integrated system's going to require a lot of holes in the roof, where I only have to typically do my mounting holes and my one wire hole. And then the panels run really hot, so the production is not as good. They're still pretty expensive. As they come down in price, that may not be a factor. It may do away with the production issue because they're producing more, right? Aesthetically, I've seen them. I don't think they look any better or different. It's obvious that they're solar, right? So they're coming. It's going to be a fairly slow adoption, particularly given the cost of a traditional system versus an integrated system. If you're working with a high-end buyer, then the cost won't be a factor. Then they'll probably want that. How'd I do? Thank you, guys.